Hi, Russ. It seems your mic's not working. Yep, there we
All
go.
right, let's try that again. Sorry about that, folks. Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA in Washington, D.C. This is our September 2nd, 2021 legislative update. Take two. As you can see from your screen, we have decided that it is now autumn. So we are moving to fall colors because we like the fall better than the summer. And even though it was 92 degrees in Washington yesterday, we're still going to pretend it's cooling down outside. This is the end of August, which is traditionally one of the slowest parts of the year in Washington, D.C. Not so much this year. Quite a bit going on, quite a bit that could affect IEEE members. Not so much policy changes over the last couple weeks, but a lot of political maneuvering that we want to kind of talk through and to explain what's going on and explain what you should expect in the next couple weeks. Jumping into the history a little bit, today is September 2nd, the anniversary of the death of J.R.R. Tolkien, author of the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit, and Andy Grove's birthday. Andy Grove was born in Hungary, in Budapest, Hungary, longtime CEO of Intel, and most importantly, IEEE member. J.R.R. Tolkien was not an IEEE member, unfortunately, but still a visionary and incredibly creative individual. So the big news coming out of Washington is the infrastructure and the reconciliation bill that we talked about last time. The structure of both bills hasn't really changed too much, but the politics of them is getting extremely complicated. So I just wanted to talk that through the politics of it with you. As you recall, the infrastructure bill has passed the Senate with a reasonably good bipartisan vote. The House leadership has committed to bringing it up for a vote before September 27th. And so September 27th has become a big deal in Washington. Now, it's a congressional deadline, so it doesn't necessarily have to remain a big deal. But basically, there is a group of Democrats in the House that have said they won't support the big reconciliation bill, more on that in a second, unless the House votes on the infrastructure bill first. In other words, they want the two bills separated. Progressives, liberals in the House, have said they won't support the infrastructure bill, the smaller bill that has passed the Senate, unless the reconciliation bill is voted at the same time. And so they've set up this dynamic where House leadership can make both groups happy if they can vote for the infrastructure bill and then immediately vote for the reconciliation bill. But if they're not able to do that, it starts to fall apart. Maybe. I mean, these are all artificial political deadlines, not real deadlines, but still it gets much, much more complicated. We'll talk about why in a moment. Which means the House leaders have essentially set September 27th as their deadline for getting the infrastructure bill and the reconciliation bill voted on, which is a pretty heavy lift because the reconciliation bill, as you will recall, is the $3.5 trillion budget resolution. This is the huge bill that will go through the reconciliation process, thus avoiding the filibuster. By the way, we toss around a lot of numbers in Washington, D.C., and I think at times you start to become kind of desensitized to how big some of these numbers are. It's worth noting that $3.5 trillion is larger than the economies of every country in the world except the United States, China, Japan, and Germany. So if this budget was a country, it'd be the fifth wealthiest country in the world, which means it's a huge bill. As we talked about last time, House and Senate are working on their bills. The committees have all been told how much money they can spend and some rough instructions on what they need to do. Hearings and work on the bill are happening right now and will continue more or less full time until they get them done. Again, the goal here is to have a bill written and ready to be voted on by mid-September. September 17th is one of the dates that's being kicked around for it to be ready, giving them roughly 10 days to actually pass the thing. House and Senate are working more or less together. The idea is that they'll both produce identical bills, making the passage of the bills much easier. Huge number of extremely complicated policies being included in the bill, which doesn't give them a lot of time to negotiate details. Oops. The problem is there's a huge number of moving parts involved in the debate here. The reconciliation bill, as we just talked about, is vast, and it hasn't been written yet. And we don't have any text. There are pieces of text that are being done, but right now they haven't written anything, so it's hard to, you can't vote on nothing. Remember that the parliamentarian has to sign off on all the provisions in the bill. Now, congressional leaders have said they are in constant communication with the parliamentarian to make sure everything that goes in the bill fits under reconciliation. I'm sure they are having those conversations, but how you work all that out gets complicated, because essentially the parliamentarian has veto power over the legislation. If she says this doesn't fit the rules, then it has to be removed, regardless of what everybody else says. Both chambers need to draft individual bills, approve them. The two bills, if they're not identical, and it's hard to imagine that they'll be precisely identical, the two versions will have to be reconciled very quickly and then passed again for it to become law. That's an awful lot to do by the end of September. President Biden has indicated he'll sign pretty much whatever they produce. So that's one level of complexity that we don't have at the moment. But there's a bunch of other things going on that Congress has to act on, if not this month, at least fairly soon. The biggest one is the debt ceiling. We have technically passed the debt ceiling, but there's things the Treasury Department can do to shift money around to buy us some additional time. But Congress is going to have to pass a debt ceiling bill probably by the end of October, maybe sooner than that, depending on how fast spending goes. And they haven't done a lot of work on it. And that's usually a tough vote. Nobody wants to vote to extend the U.S. debt. No politician wants to admit how big that cap is currently. So it's a hard vote. You want to start defaulting on bonds, which would be a horrible thing. The federal budget still needs to get done. They've made some significant progress on it, but still need to do a lot of work and are, of course, behind schedule. And then you have the NDAA, which we'll talk about in a bit, NASA reauthorization, NSF reauthorization, a couple other big government programs that need to be reauthorized by the end of the year. So that's an awful lot to do in not a huge number of months. So looking more specifically at what's going on within the Democratic caucus in the House and the House and the Senate, mostly the House, there's a growing belief in Washington that the Democrats are going to lose the House next year. That belief is based on a few things. First, just historic trends. The party that controls the presidency loses, on average, about 27 seats in the off-year election after a presidential election. It's technically 27.6 going back to 1940. There's lots of reasons for that, but given that the Democrats only have about can lose 5 seats and still hold on to the majority, the fact that historically the majority party has lost 27 seats, that's worrying to them. On top of that, you have redistricting happening this year. Simply because of population shifts, Republican states have picked up a couple congressional districts, whereas Democratic states have lost a couple congressional districts. All things being equal, that would probably represent somewhere between a 1 and 3 seat shift towards the Republicans. Normally that's not worth discussing, but when we have 5 seats, Republicans need to capture 5 seats to take over the House, a shift of even 1 is fairly significant. Then you have retirements. Already 7 or 8 Democrats have either announced their retirement or said they're going to run for some other office, Senate or governor, in marginal seats. These are either seats where Donald Trump won the presidential election or seats that it could kind of go either way. In a wave year, in a year when one party wins a lot of seats, you typically see a lot of retirements from the other party. 7 or 8 isn't a lot yet, but we're still pretty early in the process, and a couple of those, Congressman Klein from up in Wisconsin, for example, who represented Democrat, who represented one of the most Republican seats in Congress that was held by a Democrat, announced his retirement. It's going to be very hard for the Democrats to hold that seat. Then you have just general political wind. The president's popularity rating has dropped. The economy's not doing as well as people expected. Inflation is coming back. all of which have led many people in Washington to conclude the Democrats will probably lose the House next year. Now, everything in that explanation can change. Well, not the historic stuff, but everything else can change. Republicans may end up with a lot of retirements. The political winds can shift dramatically between now and basically this time next year. But that doesn't actually matter for our conversation today, because what matters is a number of Democratic House members have concluded they probably won't be in the majority next year. And this is altering their behavior. About 90% of Democrats in the House have concluded that this is one of their last chances to get anything done. If they want to move liberal Democratic agenda items, they have to do it now. So they're taking everything they can think of and putting it in the reconciliation bill, which is why it is as big as it is, because they think this is their last shot for a while until they can take the House back, which will probably be a little while. However, there's a smaller group of Democrats in the House, 20% of the caucus, maybe even 5% of the caucus, that have concluded that they personally are in danger of losing next year. Those Democrats are not looking at this as their last chance to score policy wins, but as their last chance to keep their jobs. Those Democrats are starting to do things to separate themselves from the Democratic Party nationally to shore up their credentials when they run for re-election next year. And that's the 9, it's more than this, but the 9 House members, Democratic House members, that told Nancy Pelosi that they would not support the big reconciliation bill unless the infrastructure bill was voted on first. They did that to start establishing an argument, a kind of a narrative that they can use in their re-election campaign to say that they were independent actors in Congress and not just part of the Democratic Party. The challenge here is that you can't negotiate in that environment. If certain at-risk Democrats are doing what they're doing specifically because they want to be seen disagreeing with the Democratic Party, it's very hard to reach a compromise on that one, because reaching a compromise undermines the point of the vote. They want to vote no. The further along we get, or the closer to the election we get, assuming all of the basic trends we're seeing hold, the more Democrats will start concluding that if they want to keep their job, they're going to have to start acting against their party, and it will be harder and harder for the Democrats to get anything done. Now, this happens every election, but because the margin is so narrow this year, even if a few House members, a few Democratic House members conclude that they're going to need to go off on their own, the whole system starts to fall apart. Worth noting, by the way, the Democrats are in better shape in the Senate. Republicans are protecting a lot more incumbents this year than the Democrats are. Republican incumbents are in a couple relatively blue states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, where it's going to be hard to hold. Democrats have far fewer at-risk members and fewer people they need to defend. So the thinking right now in Washington that the Senate elections next year will be either a wash, where we end up with a 50-50 split again, or the Democrats might pick up 1 or 2 seats. So that the dynamic in the Senate is a little bit different. But in the House, it's starting to become a problem for the House leaders. A couple other things, several other things. The NDAA, which we talked about last year, it's one of those must-pass bills. The House marked it up yesterday. House committee marked it up yesterday. Passed out of committee with a vote of 57-2, which is not a vote we see all that often these days. Hundreds of amendments were voted on yesterday in big chunks. We haven't finished going through all of them yet. There are some that will affect IEEE members. The one that kind of got people's attention is that there was an amendment added that would require women to register for the draft. This is one of those weird issues. Doesn't really affect IEEE, but it does split the two parties in interesting ways. It's kind of moderate Democrats and conservative Republicans tend to support it. We'll see. This has popped up before. I don't know if it'll stay in the bill, but it is in there for the moment. This is a must-pass bill, and it will pass sometime later this year. At the moment, legislators are not piling things into it, but they could. Anything that doesn't make it into reconciliation, or if reconciliation fails, Some of those provisions will be dumped into NDAA, and that will be interesting to see if they can pull that off. Interesting article in Roll Call. For those of you who don't know, Roll Call is a Washington, D.C. newspaper that covers Congress and policy issues here in Washington. It's a good newspaper online if you're interested in this sort of thing. There was an article in there called Crypto and the Infrastructure Bill. Surprising? Not at all. And I highlight this for two reasons. One, to remind you that there is still a provision in the infrastructure bill that Congress needs to remove at some point, or they may ban crypto exchanges in the United States, which is not the intent of the law. But what the article argues is that the existence of this provision, which could ban crypto exchanges, some people are arguing that it came out of nowhere, that Congress just sort of threw this on the blockchain community without really consulting with them. And the article points out that that's not actually true, that the basic idea had been kicking around for several months. There were hearings on it. It had come up on the floor. Legislators had discussed this fairly openly, but the cryptocurrency hadn't engaged with Washington. They hadn't gone to Congress and said, whoa, you guys don't understand what this is going to do. And the article makes the observation that it is, in fact, Americans' responsibility to pay attention to what's going on so that they don't get surprised when language shows up in legislation. That is, of course, one of the reasons we have this update every other Thursday. Little activity on right to repair, specifically in Pennsylvania. There are two interesting bills being considered by the Pennsylvania legislature. One is HB 1757 by Delegate Representative Howard. Howard's bill is actually an interesting take on right to repair. It's technically a product labeling law. The bill creates a criteria for giving a given product a numerical score to show how repairable it is. So if it's easy to get parts, it's easy to get documentation, it's easy to take a piece of equipment apart, it gets a high score. If those things aren't true, it gets a low score. An innovative and kind of unique approach to the idea of right to repair. And that score has to go on the box for a product to be sold in Pennsylvania. It applies to all electronics products. Representative Diamond, HB 1152, has a more traditional right to repair bill that's being considered. It simply requires manufacturers to make documentation and parts available to allow people to repair their product. Both bills are bipartisan. Both are sitting in the Commerce Committee within the Pennsylvania legislature. Any IEEE members who are interested should give me a call and we can talk about what's going on and what the prospects of both bills are. At the moment, they're kind of iffy this year, but these ideas frequently take a couple of years to kind of take hold. A little bit on cybersecurity. There is a bill. It actually hasn't been introduced yet. Congresswoman Clark from New York has released a draft version of the bill. There's a picture of it there if you're interested. It's called the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act. Here's what the text of the bill says. It creates a new Cyber Incident Review Office within the Department of Homeland Security and requires covered entities to report any cyber attacks to that office, which will then compile, organize, and kind of track cyber attacks. Okay. The bill currently does not define what a covered entity is. It clearly is critical infrastructure, but that could be a lot of things or it could be relatively few things. Doesn't define what reporting is exactly, what information is included in those reports. Doesn't say what the new agency should do once it gets these reports. And it doesn't answer some of the basic questions like what is a company's liability if they tell the government about an attack that ended up with them losing some personal information, credit card information, or something like that. Can that report be used as evidence in court to sue the company? Which, of course, would make collecting information very tricky. The point of this is that this bill, as written, as Congresswoman Clark wrote it, is not designed to pass. What it's designed to do is become the focal point of a discussion about what this bill should look like. Now, Congress has tackled this issue before. They spent a lot of time on it last year and couldn't reach an agreement. Congresswoman Clark's idea here is that by drafting something and sending it out and inviting people to comment on it, she can take another stab at finding a compromise position that answers all the key questions, which are not in her bill yet, because she didn't want to kind of prejudice the conversation. So her bill, while it in and of itself isn't actually much of anything, it's an important step to trying to find some consensus for how to handle an issue that Congress is having a really hard time getting its head around. And so we applaud Congresswoman Clark for her effort, and look forward to working with her to try to find language that works, that would allow us to start improving the cyber defenses of our country. A couple other little things. The administration has created what is called the U.S. Digital Corps. It's a relatively small program. It's only 30 people, and within the vastness of the federal government, that's pretty tiny. But the idea is it creates a new way for agencies to hire people with technical expertise. We've been seeing this over the last 10 years or so, where the government has recognized that the government's traditional hiring system doesn't really work for people with technical skills. It's too slow. You're talking about people who don't necessarily want to go through the normal GS promotion system. People with highly specialized skills that in the private sector would make vastly more than the traditional GS system. And so the government has been toying with ways to hire people with technical IT experts, cybersecurity experts, people like that, outside of the traditional procurement process, the traditional hiring process. And this is another attempt at that. It's, like I said, it's a small program, but it's a step towards a bigger reform to the government workforce. Interesting report on Google, Jigsaw Google, on government-imposed internet shutdowns. Various countries around the world have figured out ways to essentially turn the internet off to their country in certain circumstances. Apparently, governments are getting better at that. And if you're interested, there's the link to the report. It's a good report and worth reading. Roll Call again had an interesting report on China's acquisition of personal bio data on people. They apparently have built the largest database of personally identifiable biological fingerprints and DNA and retina scans and things like that in the world, which has raised some concerns both in the United States and globally. Lastly, one of the commissioners on the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission announced this week that he believes the EEOC has jurisdiction to regulate the use of artificial intelligence in hiring. EEOC is run by a panel of 5 political appointees. Mr. Keith Soderberg is merely one of those. But these EOC exists essentially to enforce employment law. When there's disputes between employees and employers over fair treatment and pay and working conditions and things like that, the EEOC can adjudicate them. The EEOC can also make workplace rules that apply to all workforce or workplaces in the country with more than 15 employees. And Commissioner Soderberg has asserted, and this isn't official, it's not policy, but it is his belief that when companies use artificial intelligence to process resumes and to play a role in the hiring process, that system is subject to EEOC oversight. In other words, the agency can say the algorithms you're using are discriminating against this type of potential employee, and therefore the system is biased and therefore is illegal. Now, again, the fact that the commissioner believes this doesn't in and of itself mean anything, but it does mean that people are starting to think about this and think about ways that they can get involved in regulating AI and controlling how AI is used. Maybe good, maybe bad, depending on what they do. But there are policymakers who are thinking about this. And with that, next update is Thursday, September 16th. We should be, in theory, getting close to the end game on the reconciliation and infrastructure bills. We will certainly by then know if there's any chance at all that Congress will hit their September 27th deadline. We also should know a lot more about the 2022 budget by then. And if you have any questions about anything that I covered today or anything that I failed to cover today, please enter them in your chat box, which I'll rotate to in just a moment. While you're doing that, I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA in Washington, D.C. My phone number is 202-530-8326. Email address is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. And with that, I'm going to switch screens here real quick to pull up the questions. Question from my Vice President, Will Robinson. Two questions, actually. What is the likelihood of a continuing resolution for the budget, and how will the debt ceiling debate play out? I'm 99% sure that we're going to get a continuing resolution. Frankly, I can't envision at this point Congress getting the budget done by October 1st. They just have too much other stuff to do, and the reconciliation bill is going to suck up basically all of their time between now and the end of the month. And they don't really feel any need to get the budget done because they'll just do a CR and kick it off till later in the year, as they've done pretty much every year for the past 15 or 20 years, with like one exception. So there will be a continuing resolution. I don't know whether that it will continue into October, and then we'll get another one till November and another one till December. I don't see them getting the budget done until maybe before Thanksgiving and probably right after Thanksgiving in early December. As opposed to the debt ceiling, that's an interesting question. Excuse me. The debt ceiling debate is always messy. On one hand, the policy is actually pretty straightforward. The U.S. federal government is authorized to borrow a certain amount of money. And once it hits that cap, it can't borrow anymore. Well, we're running a massive structural deficit, and we have a number of other bills on top of that spend additional money. So we have to borrow money, which means Congress has to pass a law giving the government, the Treasury Department specifically, the authority to sell bonds to make more money. So the policy is pretty straightforward. We're going to borrow money. We're going to borrow a lot of money, so we have to sell bonds. Okay. The problem is that politically, that is a very messy debate. And it's messy because a lot of Americans aren't really happy about the fact that we're borrowing money. A lot of Americans aren't really happy about the amount of money we're borrowing and the amount of debt we have. Well, you can't discuss the debt ceiling without touching on all of those issues, which politicians would, generally speaking, prefer the American public didn't remember. On top of that, the Republicans have already indicated that they're not going to do much to help the Democrats with the debt ceiling. Their position is that since you're not talking to us about the reconciliation bill, we're not going to work with you on the debt ceiling, which is fine because the Democrats do control both chambers of Congress. And at the end of the day, some of the Republicans will vote to increase the debt ceiling because it has to get done. But getting to the point where people say, okay, enough of the nonsense, we have to pass the bill, is going to be hard. Congress is not working on this right now, at least not publicly. It's something that can get done very quickly if Congress wants to. But the fun part of the debate is we don't actually know when the bill has to be passed. Technically, we've already hit the debt ceiling. We hit it a month or so ago. But the Treasury Department can fiddle with things and move things around a little bit to extend the deadline. But we don't actually know when we hit that real deadline where the Treasury Department just has to say, hey, we're done. We can't borrow any more money. And we can't, we have to borrow money to pay the debt on the bonds we've already sold. So we start getting into a default position when that happens. So when Congress turns to this, I would expect the debate to be very quick. I would expect the House and Senate leaders to already have a plan, already have a bill, introduce it, move it, vote on it, and get on with life very, very quickly. And they will pass it. I mean, the implications of not passing it are pretty severe, but it's going to be a little bloody before they actually pull it off. Mr. Parnell, is Congress addressing Colonial Pipeline hack in any way? The answer is yes, although they're not doing it directly. There are a ton of pieces of legislation focusing on cybersecurity. Providing cybersecurity for critical infrastructure like pipelines, like water treatment plants, like the electrical grid, and more general legislation as well to help the government deal with this problem more directly. Some of the more innovative ideas that are kicking around in various bills, including the infrastructure bill, which has passed the Senate, would be additional federal funds to hire cybersecurity experts, a new federal program to train existing federal workers in cyber defenses. The idea there is that not every agency, and certainly not every state agency, and certainly, definitely not every local government agency can afford to hire a cybersecurity expert. But most of them don't actually need a cybersecurity expert. What they need is someone who understands cybersecurity and can implement solutions developed by somebody else. So the idea is we can train some of the existing federal workforce to provide cyber services to agencies without having to hire someone new. It's probably true if it works in some cases, although there's still going to be a big demand for cyber experts. So to answer your question, there is no kind of colonial pipeline bill, but there are bills that include language to strengthen our cyber defenses for critical infrastructure like the pipeline that are working their way through Congress. And we do expect some of that language to become a law by the end of the year, the infrastructure bill being the biggest, which we still do expect to pass at some point. I do not see any other questions. And so, again, apologize for the small technical glitch at the beginning. Didn't have my microphone plugged in all the way. I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA in Washington, D.C. Feel free to reach out anytime if you need help understanding or working with your local, state, or federal government. IEEE-USA's government relations professionals are always pleased to help. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope everyone has a wonderful Labor Day. Thank you.
With the advancements in new technology, the landscape for power systems is changing very rapidly. Information technology has really made a huge difference in enabling some of the things that we work on. I've been able to leverage IEEE USA to be in the leading edge of my industry. IEEE is all about a sense of community. I am learning ideas and concepts and thinking completely out of the box. IEEE USA is my